Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability in Business here at Lancaster University Management School. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Bovington.
Now Jan, so far in this series we have been to the USA, we've been to Australia, and today we're going abroad once more. This time we're going to Sweden.
And in Sweden there's lots of really super scientists, and one of my most favourite super scientists is our guest today.
Yes, that would be Professor Henrik Österblom, who is Director of the Anthropocene Laboratory at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. I said this last time and I'll say it again, Royal.
We left the Royal out once and we got in big trouble. Yeah.
Did you leave the Royal out? That's disgraceful. How can you forget the Royal? I'm wondering if it means that so many people in line to the throne is Henrik.
I think he's number 5 in line to the throne.
No, that's quite high. That's like a crown prince. Right. As well as being a crown prince of Sweden, Henrik was a key player in the founding of the Seafood Business for Ocean Stewardship project, that's SEABOS. And you may remember we discussed that with Jean-Baptiste Jouffret from Stanford at the start of the year.
So, welcome Henrik.
Thank you so much. And nice to be a super scientist. I think that's the first. Appreciate that.
So, as a super scientist, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to be working with the SEABOS project? But also, I suppose for our listeners, I have to say that Henrik and I work very closely together as well. So how did an organisational science and an ecologist start working together as well? So why are you here? Where have you come from?
Starting out as a marine biologist, I really wanted to learn about marine biology because I was keen to understand the ecosystems and to also figure out what could be done about them, because I felt when I was starting doing my studies that there was a lot of work on agriculture and forests and everything on land, but very little work done when it comes to improving the situation in the ocean. So I wanted to become a marine biologist, and I was accepted to a marine biology program in Bamfield, a place on the Canadian west coast, and there a seabird ecologist asked if there were any volunteers who wanted to stay on this faraway island to study the birds that he was working on as a way to understand the dynamics of the ocean ecosystem. And I said yes, and I get to spend 2 months on an incredible island with bird poo up to my elbows. So I think that was my start. Yeah, and I got back to Sweden and I finished my biology degree there, also working with seabirds as a way to understand the Baltic Sea ecosystems. And from that, I became much more interested in the management of ocean ecosystems. And I did a postdoc after my PhD on birds and ecosystems that focused much more on the management on the national resources in Antarctica. And there I learned quite a lot about how the seafood industry worked with governments and civil society organizations to solve common problems with illegal fishing. So with those experience from understanding biology and understanding management practices and understanding the role that industry could play to improve the situation in the ecosystem, I was fascinated by the fact that I didn't even know who the biggest seafood companies in the world were. So Jean-Baptiste and I did a study on that took us about 2 years to complete. And that basically resulted in this hypothesis that a handful of keystone actors are big and powerful enough to change the seafood production system. When that work was presented, you, Jan, attended a seminar with Carl Folke, and you contacted me, and we had fun ever since.
So one of the interesting things about our joint work is that we kind of got to know about each other's fields through the idea of the Anthropocene. And at the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, you're running the Anthropocene Lab. So this will be a really good time for our listeners to find out what is the Anthropocene and what does it mean?
Well, the Anthropocene is a word that was coined by Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen 25 years ago almost as a way to describe the human impacts on biological and chemical and physical processes over in the entire biosphere, the entire planet Earth. Basically as a way to describe the massive impact that humans have on everything that's happening. And you may be aware there's been an ongoing conversation whether or not the Anthropocene should be defined as an epoch or an era or an event and all the rest. The responsible committee for deciding on this decided that it's actually not an epoch. But it doesn't take away the fact that humans are everywhere and are influencing all kinds of processes from chemical flows to water to our climate and so on. So the Anthropocene is basically a a useful metaphor to describe the predicament that we're in, but also perhaps some of the opportunities that represents to be a completely interconnected world with interconnected management practices and value chains and governance arrangements. A shared understanding that these are problems that we have to deal with if we're interested in the survival of humanity. So it's not an epoch by definition, but it's still a useful way to describe some of these interconnected challenges that we're facing.
And how does thinking about our current situation as the Anthropocene change how we think about the problems that we are facing?
As a small example, I think the seabird project illustrates the interconnectivity of this world that we're living in, and the fact that we can work between science and industry on sort of in North America, Europe, and East and Southeast Asia in a collaborative effort to solve some of the joint problems using digital technologies and being interconnected in many different ways illustrates that the world is different now compared to what it was 30 or 40 or 70 years ago. And on the one hand, there's more of a shared recognition of the challenges that we face, but also new opportunities to connect actors around engaging in those challenges. So I think the key thing here is that we're dependent on what happens in Ukraine, we're dependent on what happens in Gaza, we're dependent on what happens everywhere around the world, and with that realization also comes lots of new opportunities, I think. But of course it's also quite scary to see some of these cascading effects when it comes to geopolitics and food security and all the rest. But clearly something has changed in the last few decades that illustrates that the world is different than what it used to be.
One of the phrases on the Anthropocene Lab's website is they talk about polycrisis and also Anthropocene traps. I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners what's meant by those terms.
Well, that was a study that colleague Peter Sørgaard Jørgensen led and was published earlier this year. And it tries to illustrate some of the major fixes that we are in. For instance, there are some examples of human behaviors that really lock us into unsustainable trajectories. There are examples of animals who have been sort of evolutionary, sort of geared to exhibit a certain number of behaviors, but in the Anthropocene and a human-dominated planet, those behaviors are actually detrimental. So there's a couple of examples of lock-ins or traps or detrimental behaviors that when you start engaging in them, things just get worse and worse. And in the paper, there's examples of albatrosses eating plastics or frogs eating light bulbs or tortoises eating plastic bags, because they were evolutionary geared to survive with visual cues to exhibit that kind of behaviors, and now those behaviors basically are eradicating these animals or results in sort of negative effects on them. And similarly, the paper talks about some of the new technologies that may sort of risk erode democracy when it comes to social media, or increasing inequalities that erodes democracy, and so on. So that's a sort of self-reinforcing feedbacks that you have to focus on. How do you break those traps and negative behaviors?
It's interesting now that a few of the examples you give with regards to the natural world relate to plastics. And obviously plastics are not something that's been around for as long as human beings have been around. They've been around 100 years or so. I don't know when plastics were invented, but not that long in the grand scheme of things. So does that suggest that there's been an acceleration of the effects of the Anthropocene over the last century or so?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember exactly the figures now, but I think the amount of plastics that we produce every year is equivalent to the total mass of the human species. So I think just like the sheer scale of things is quite remarkable. And if you combine sort of the plastics and concrete and cement that we produce or have produced, it's more than the entire biosphere of the planet. And when it comes to the amount of biomass in mammals or birds, most of these mammals or birds are actually humans or domesticated animals rather than what we normally look at as wild animals. So there's been a complete shift in who's in control of this planet, whether or not it's I mean, of course, humans are natural things, but whether or not there are like non-human processes, natural processes, or human-driven processes. And I think those examples of the amount of plastics, the amount of man-made, human-made materials, the amount of domesticated animals really illustrate that there's been a big shift in sort of the balance of who it is that's sort of influencing the planet.
We've talked about the Anthropocene, and you are the director of the Anthropocene Lab. What kind of work are you undertaking there?
The lab is the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and this academy is a rather traditional institution. It awards prizes in physics and chemistry, and it has sort of those traditional disciplinary focus in much of their work. The Anthropocene Laboratory is a new activity here, and the ambition is to try to stretch across disciplines, across natural and social sciences, working with scholars from the humanities and with artists. So really trying to cross boundaries to have new kinds of conversations and look at new ways of seeing the problems and working together to identify solutions or ways of communicating. So it's a bit of an exploratory activity, and we're not quite sure what we are doing yet. And I think that's quite exciting. We've only been around we had our inauguration a month ago and only had staff colleagues for the last 6 months. So we're trying to figure out what it is that we're doing. Crossing disciplines to engage with the big sustainability challenges with an Anthropocene focus, really having a sort of a large-scale perspective on these issues across disciplines and regions. Developing synthesis, understanding, and finding ways to communicate, and everything from art exhibitions to dialogues with corporate executives and what have you. I think these are all things that we're exploring the opportunities to engage in right now.
I know that Jan always takes it as a massive positive when you don't necessarily know what you're doing, because it shows the signs that you're open to possibility and that you recognise that there are not necessarily definitive answers.
Well, especially when we're dealing with the Anthropocene, as Henrik has described it, where you've got that scale and pace of change is much larger than you might expect, and the interconnectivity is strong and sometimes creates negative feedback loops. And I suppose some of what you were talking about, the albatrosses eating plastic and dying with empty tummies but full of plastic, is sort of really it's distressing, and it's really sort of, stuff that upsets people appropriately. But then you've also sort of highlighted, and one of the projects that you're working on is called the Empirics of Hope. And I think that that emotional work of not just sort of drowning in the dreadfulness of what we might observe becomes quite important. So can you tell me about the Empirics of Hope? Because I know you individually to be somebody who has a very strong vision as well, and a sense of the possible. You were when I last talked to you. It may have been disappearing from you now, but that Empirics of Hope, I think, is really important alongside a scientific understanding of problems.
Yeah, I agree. And I think scientists have done a really good job in describing many of the challenges that humanity is facing when it comes to current and projected impacts from climate change and so on. I think many people are very much aware of the challenges, and a lot of people also feel pretty bad about that and disempowered. While at the same time, I think this is true for you as well, Jan, when we work with these corporate executives, these big bad companies, actually they are some amazing people in there, and really strong leadership, and really an ambition and a willingness to do something good and useful. And in that CBOS project, I really have experienced that people want to do as good as they can, and they want to use the platforms that they have to enable positive change for themselves and for their company or for their community or whatever it may be. So there's huge positive forces in the world when it comes to in the corporate sector, in activists in the streets, governments making bold decisions about protecting and restoring biodiversity, new technologies developing. So there's like an avalanche of exciting positive things that suggest that we are, as a species, trying to realign society's energy, transport, food systems to the reality that we're facing, and that we are actually perhaps even in the middle or the beginning at least of a sustainability revolution. But these conversations are rarely heard in the scientific communities that I engage in, at least. And that's why we thought that why don't we try to collect evidence of some of these changes, some of the capacities that are developing when it comes to legal rights to nature or changes to solar voltaic or whatever it may be, and look across sectors and regions for these kinds of positive signs. I mean, you could only find negative signs if you only look for negative signs, but if you look for positive signs, you could possibly find positive signs. And if you can't, well, you're screwed. But I mean, the point is just like, give this an honest try to see what will you find if you look. And already we found quite a bit, and we've brought together a community of really exciting scholars on this topic. And the nice thing is that in the invitation, many people answered us like, the fact that you ask us to think about hope makes us more hopeful. So there's something very fundamental human in the concept of hope and to work on it. And of course, Rebecca Solnit, the American author, has written beautifully about that. But I think we also like to tell the horrible stories because it's sort of exciting to think about, disaster and death and destruction. But there's so much positive out there at so many different scales, from your local community to, UN institutions and everything in between. So yeah, I'm just excited to learn more about that and to try to see if we can provide a bit of a more comprehensive picture of what's actually happening out there, and also ask the question, well, what can you do to help, move these things in the right direction?
I always knew, Jan, that when you were being gloomy and dismissive of all our hope for humanity, that there were people out there who would have hope. And I'm glad to meet Henrik and that he is one of them.
Yeah. But I also think what's interesting about how he's describing hope is that there's some really neat work that people have been doing on like bright spots in the Anthropocene. So where are good things happening? And you can imagine it as sort of thinking about, well, okay, you could look at all the businesses in Cumbria as we have in a previous podcast and say, look, these guys are doing good things. So to see good things is one thing. To craft an empirical understanding of how good things come into being and can be made larger and sustained is another intellectual task. And I think that's, if you like, what's ahead of us as well, not just sort of being cheerful about a few things and then sort of seeing this ongoing trend, but actually how do you master it? How do you put it together? How do you make it happen?
How do you take the examples that other people have given you and follow on from them and build on them? And that's exactly what we were talking about with Joanne Larty about the businesses in Cumbria and how that they can learn from each other and apply best practice. And if we can do this across the whole planet, wonderful.
And I think the combined wisdom and knowledge and courage and versions of hope across the planet must be enormous and positive.
Do you find with the empirics of hope, Henrik, that there are some people you come across who just can't buy into it, some people who are just naturally pessimistic about the situation with the planet and the Anthropocene?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it comes down to sort of your approach and your values and maybe even your personality. And I think it also changes, on different days. I'm not hopeful every day. Like yesterday, I was listening to the Swedish Council on the climate policies that the Swedish government is sort of engaged in. They're evaluating the Swedish climate policies, and everything in that report looks horrible. Like they're not doing their job. And they present it to the minister, and she says, no, we're fine. It's like, wait a minute. I mean, all these experts that you call together to evaluate your policy says you're not. So how can you say you're fine? So when there's this complete sort of failure to listen, to absorb and act on, empirical knowledge, then it's just like, really? So I think these are things that we're increasingly experiencing where politicians, you can say whatever you want to them and they will still say whatever, what they want to say. So on days like that, I'm like, wow, we're in trouble. But but on the other hand, there also, I found a lot of colleagues from some disciplines who just like, they don't see any positives with the situation we're in at all. Capitalism is, deteriorating human health and inequality is increasing and everything is just going down the tubes, and if you're focusing on that, it's very difficult to be hopeful. Or on the other hand, if you're focusing more on the accelerating impacts on climate change and dying coral reefs and this sort of, I've read that today that the science of life is actually the science of dying, which is like a bit horrible when you look at like the way many biologists now see their systems basically collapsing. I think then too it could be very difficult to be hopeful. So I think we maybe we're grabbing on to sort of the last, I don't know what the saying is in English, but the point is to give this a try and to be, not too optimistic or upbeat about everything will be fine, because it's not like that, but it's not like everything is going straight to hell either. And we do have a window to act here. And I think that's the exciting thing to understand. Well, what are examples and what are mechanisms and what can, individuals and collectives and networks actually achieve? What are good examples of producing results? So,
and I think that leads really well into a conversation about imagination as well. And one of the things I've really admired about the kind of science that you do is that weaving of creativity and different forms of art, whether it be literature, poetry, visual medium of various sorts, comes together through and alongside your scientific work. Why is that? Why have you put that fusion together in your own work and thinking?
I've been introduced to art, mainly with the help of my mom when I was a kid, and I never really understood why she kept on introducing me to art. But it's only as an adult I realized I was actually a nice part of my brain that needed some development. And also colleagues who introduced me to really interesting artists, and just finding ways to learn from each other and work together. Yeah, it's a good question, Jan. I've always been interested to learn new things, like most scientists, I guess. I didn't think I was much of a field ecologist, but then I work in a field station. I learned a lot there. I worked in the Swedish government, and I learned a lot there. I worked construction. I learned a lot there. I worked with companies and artists, and I learned a lot there. So I just find there's so many fascinating people in the world, and there's so many different ways of looking at the world. And when you combine those things, of course, you will learn new things. And artists in particular has been really helpful in encouraging me to follow my intuition more clearly, and not just use this method or work with this approach, but rather to sort of roam around a little bit and to, like you were saying, Paul, to stay in that uncertainty, because that's where the interesting things happen. Don't worry if you don't know what you're doing. You'll figure it out. That's the way many of the artists that I work with do. They're completely terrified all the time, and if they're not, they don't think that they are doing their job. And I think that's a nice attitude.
Do the artists, the creative people, bring a different kind of hope? If we're talking about the empirics of hope, and we're going back to that, do they have different kinds of hope and different ways of expressing it than scientists do? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I've written about this before, but one of the Chilean artists that I work with, one day he said, Henrik, one day the world will be perfect. And it's like, what do you mean? Well, it keeps on getting better all the time, so logically it will be perfect one day. And I think that the boldness in that thinking is just, it's completely beautiful. And it's like, oh, it's childish and naive. But yeah, it's like the way to think without boundaries completely is super inspiring to me. And I refuse to put any boundaries on my thinking, is what this man is saying. And I will think like this. How about that, and so that opens up a completely different conversation rather than, well, what are the trends and what does the data look like and what do we know from history? When you sort of analyze every situation, it's a different, you constrain yourself immediately. So I think that sort of childish curiosity and limitless thinking is, very inspiring. And I think science in general could benefit from that.
Do you think that artistic outputs, artworks, can be used for scientific purposes in this way to somehow help with maybe the communication or maybe something else to do with how we consider the Anthropocene?
Yeah, I think art normally stimulates people's imagination and help you think differently about things. So Stockholm University has an art exhibition place called The Accelerator, and they have gathered scientists on a couple of occasions around art pieces just to stimulate conversations. And those conversations normally have been, super inspiring. And it just makes everyone, on equally uncertain terms. So it's not like my discipline or my method and you're welcome here and it's on my conditions, but rather you're on some sort of, unknown space, and then you can have a conversation around that. So that's, to me, has been very exciting to see. It's basically just a sort of unlocking the playfulness in scientists. In that way, I find art has been really helpful on a number of occasions.
I'd like to return to thinking about your career and how it's put together. And so there's lots of points of connectivity. So when you're talking about empirics of hope and the use of imagination, it's still analytical. It's still trying to understand the relationships between parts of a system and how they might come together and evolve and create change and outcomes of various sorts. And even though that seems a long way from being a seabird ecologist, I would argue that they are the same qualities and the same principles of thinking that reflect where you are now as well. And I wonder, what's the next evolution for you in terms of thinking about what you might like to write, how you might like to communicate, and the kind of work that you're planning to do next?
I was thinking about that quite a lot, and without really thinking too much about it, I started to write a book with a colleague of mine. We wrote a couple of papers together that we both had a lot of fun writing. One we called Unsustainable Science, and one we called Earth Altruism. So like super flaky titles and really like spaced out papers, but we had a lot of fun writing them. But they were still sort of scientific in a way, in scientific journals and peer reviewed. So him and I, we started to write this, more sort of free flowing text where art and science and personal experience and data on the human relationship with the biosphere is sort of interwoven in a very sort of it's not fiction, but it's not science, and it's just some kind of weird mix of text that basically talks through all the different ecosystems of the world and how we as humans can relate to them, and then thinking about some of the more fundamental aspects of what it's about to be human in that. So playing around in some kind of space that combines personal experience, scientific data, understanding of art, and something else. I mean, it's funny because we write these chapters, and like the chapter on the desert started to be about war and conflict, and the chapter about the coastal zone ended up being about parenthood, and the chapter on wind ended up being about love, and the deep sea was about aging and dying. So I don't know, just having a lot of fun with sort of mixing things up, and I guess as a scientist or as like in any profession, the trick is to find what is it that you like to do and what is it that you're good at. And I think it takes a bit of time to find your voice and your approach, and I think I'm getting there still.
And that certainly follows on, I think, really nicely from your book on the sounds of science, that wove together storylines to help understand the CBOS initiative as well. So along with the empirical work of what happened with the orchestration of those companies together to do things, there was also material about how it felt to you, but also how it felt to those participating in it as well. So it's not a step away from where I know you've been, but it sounds like a really exciting pushing further on that theme.
Yeah, it's the next step. Yeah, that's a good point.
Before we come to a close, Henrik, you were a seabird ecologist. I'm just interested, what's your favourite seabird?
Obviously the common guillemot. I mean, the most silly bird that you could possibly imagine that can hardly fly. And it's just completely hilarious bird. And it's really fun to study them, and they tell us a lot about ourselves and the ocean that they live in.
I've got a soft spot for a gannet, but I have to say, hands down, the puffin. Yeah, Atlantic puffin. That's my favourite. Love the beak. Nice and colourful. Wow. And they dance around like silly things when they're on land.
Yeah, I quite like them on land, because on land they don't seem to worry about things, which is maybe quite unwise, but yeah.
Do you have a favourite seabird?
Seabird.
Well, you're not a seabird ecologist.
No, but see, penguins.
Penguins?
Yeah, because I'm mad as well.
Are they seabirds? I suppose they live in the sea. Henrik, are they seabirds by the traditional sense, penguins?
Yeah, you can say that. They can't fly, but I mean, still a bird, so...
I'll let you have that.
Thank you.
The seabird ecologist says you can have it, you can have it. Thank you very much, Henrik. That's been a wonderful conversation.
Well, we could tell when we got on to which is your favourite bird that was probably wrapping up, wasn't it?
Well, I said we're going to wrap up, but I wanted to ask about that. It was an important question. You can't let a seabird ecologist come on the show and not ask him what his favourite seabird is.
Fair enough.
Next time, we'll be asking some farmers what their favourite farm animal is, I suppose. Because we're actually going out into the field, literally into the field for the first time. We're going to be taking Transforming Tomorrow on the road, and we're going to be discussing with the Lake District farmers issues around sustainability and climate change for farms in Cumbria. And that'll be a little mini-series of about 4 or 5 episodes.
I'm very much looking forward to the sheep.
Yes, I know you're really looking forward to anything that's got 4 legs and is going to be there to meet us. And we might just end up recording the sounds of sheep, cows, dogs, ducks, whatever else they have. Goats, maybe goats. We'll
see.
find out. In the meantime, if you do have any questions for us, please do email pentlandcentre@lancaster.ac.uk. We'll see you soon. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jan Babington.